The smell of American soil came through the wooden slats before Heinrich Vogel could see it. It smelled like rain and cut grass and something else he could not name. Something that reminded him of childhood summers in Bavaria, before the uniforms, before the marching, before the world caught fire. He pressed his eye to the gap between the boards. Golden wheat fields stretched in every direction, endless and unbroken, shimmering under a late August sun. He had expected smokestacks, prison walls, guard towers with machine guns. Instead, he saw farmland that looked exactly like the countryside outside Munich. The train had been moving for 3 days. 47 German prisoners sat in what had once been a cattle car, now fitted with narrow benches and a single bucket in the corner. Some men slept. Others stared at nothing. A boy named Fischer, barely 18, had cried for the first 100 miles before going silent. Heinrich was 31 years old. Before the war, he taught history to children in a village school. He told them about ancient Rome, about the wars of Frederick the Great, about the unification of Germany. He never imagined he would become part of history himself. He never imagined he would surrender to American soldiers in a muddy field in Normandy, his rifle empty, his squad dead, his war over. The invasion had come in June. Operation Overlord, the Allies called it. Heinrich called it the end. He watched the sky fill with parachutes, watched the beaches explode with fire, watched his commanding officer take a bullet through the throat. When the Americans found him hiding in a barn 3 weeks later, he raised his hands without hesitation. He was tired of killing. He was tired of watching men die. Now he was somewhere in the middle of America, rolling through farmland that seemed to have no end. The other prisoners talked in low voices about what awaited them. Labor camps, mines, factories. Some believed they would be shot. Others hoped they would simply be forgotten that a man named Brenner sat in the corner, his face hard as stone. He had been an officer in the Waffen-SS before his capture. He still wore his arrogance like a medal. He told the younger prisoners that Germany would win the war, that the Führer had secret weapons that would turn the tide, that their captivity was temporary. Heinrich said nothing. He had stopped believing in victory long before he stopped believing in the cause. The train slowed. Heinrich felt the brakes grind and the car shudder. Men stirred, reaching for their meager belongings. Through the slats, he saw a water tower, a grain elevator, a small station platform. He saw a sign painted in faded letters, New Ulm, Minnesota. Heinrich read it twice, then a third time. Ulm, like the city in Baden-Württemberg, like the city where his grandmother had been born. The doors slid open. Sunlight poured in, blinding after the darkness of the car. American soldiers stood on the platform, rifles at rest, faces bored. They shouted orders in English that Heinrich only half understood. Form a line. Move forward. No talking. He stepped on his solid ground for the first time in days. His legs ached. His mouth was dry. He squinted at the small town before him. Red brick buildings, a church steeple, a banner hanging from a storefront that read Volksfest, September 15th. Then he heard voices nearby. 2 farmers stood beside a wagon, discussing the weather. They spoke in German, not English, with a few German words mixed in. Pure, clear, old-fashioned German, the kind his grandfather used to speak. Heinrich stopped walking. A guard shoved him forward, but he barely felt it. He stared at the farmers. They wore overalls and straw hats. They looked like any farmers he might have seen in Saxony or Thuringia. But they were American. They had to be American. One of them noticed Heinrich staring. The farmer nodded politely, as if greeting a neighbor, then turned back to his conversation. Heinrich's mind raced. He thought of the history he used to teach. The waves of German immigrants who crossed the Atlantic in the 1800s. The millions who settled in the American Midwest, building towns, planting farms, keeping their language alive. He had read about these communities in books. He never expected to stand in one. The guards herded the prisoners toward a row of waiting trucks. Heinrich climbed aboard, his burned hands gripping the tailgate. As the engine rumbled to life, he looked back at the town one more time. German names on every storefront. German voices in the summer air. German faces watching him pass that he did not understand. These people shared his blood, his language, his history, and yet their sons were fighting to destroy everything he had been forced to defend. Somewhere across the ocean, American soldiers with names like Muller and Hoffman and Vogel were killing German soldiers with the same names. The truck lurched forward. Heinrich closed his eyes. He had survived the war, but he was not sure he would survive this strange new world where the enemy looked exactly like home. The Mueller farm sat at the end of a dirt road lined with oak trees, so old they must have been planted by the first settlers. Heinrich counted 7 German names on mailboxes before the truck stopped. Schmidt, Weber, Hoffman, Baua. Each name was a ghost from another life. .12 prisoners climbed down from the truck bed. An American corporal handed a clipboard to an old man waiting by the barn. The old man wore faded overalls and a straw hat that had seen 20 summers. His face was weathered like driftwood, but his eyes were sharp and blue. "We'll come in," the old man said. "Welcome." He spoke German with an accent Heinrich had never heard before. It was softer than Bavarian, older than Prussian, as if the language had been preserved in amber for 100 years. "I am Wilhelm Müller. You will work my harvest. You will eat at my table. You will sleep in my barn. If you cause trouble, the soldiers will take you away. If you work hard, you will be treated fairly." Heinrich translated for the others. Some nodded. Brenner spat on the ground. The farm stretched across 300 acres of wheat, corn, and barley. The war had created labor shortages across America. Young men had gone to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Old men and women struggled to bring in the harvests. The government had offered a solution. German prisoners of war, nearly 400,000 of them scattered across the country, would work the fields. It was efficient. It was practical. It was deeply strange. Heinrich was assigned to the wheat fields. He worked alongside a prisoner named Kohler, a former baker from Hamburg, and an American guard named Davis who spent most of his time reading newspapers in the shade. The work was hard but honest. Heinrich's hands blistered. His back ached. But there was something clean about the labor, something that washed away the mud and blood of Normandy that Wilhelm's wife, Ingrid, brought water and sandwiches at midday. She spoke German as naturally as breathing. She told Heinrich that her grandmother had come from the Black Forest in 1861, bringing nothing but a trunk of clothes and a recipe for apple strudel. 4 generations later, the recipe survived, but most of the young people had stopped speaking the old language. "My grandson refuses to learn," Ingrid said, shaking her head. "He says German is the enemy's tongue now." Heinrich met the grandson that evening. Thomas Mueller was 17 years old, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's suspicious eyes. He stood at the edge of the barn, watching the prisoners eat their supper, his arms crossed over his chest. "You're the teacher," Thomas said in English. His voice was flat, unfriendly. Heinrich understood enough to nod. "Yeah, I taught history. My father is in France," Thomas said. "Fighting your people." Heinrich said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had been in France too, on the other side of the guns. He might have fired the bullet that wounded Thomas's father, or Thomas's father might have killed one of Heinrich's friends. The math of war was simple and terrible. That night, Heinrich lay on a pile of straw, staring at the barn roof. He could hear Wilhelm's family in the farmhouse, their voices drifting through the open window. Someone was playing a piano. Someone else was laughing. The sounds were so ordinary, so peaceful, that Heinrich felt his chest tighten with longing. Brenner sat in the corner, whispering to a group of younger prisoners. Heinrich caught fragments of his words. Traitors, race betrayers, enemies of the Reich. Brenner still believed in the old poison. He saw the German Americans as the worst kind of enemy, people who had abandoned the fatherland and now fought to destroy it. "They are not our people," Brenner hissed. "They chose America. They chose to betray their blood." Heinrich turned away. He thought about Wilhelm's grandfather, crossing the Atlantic in a wooden ship, leaving behind everything he knew. He thought about the millions of Germans who had made the same journey, seeking land and freedom and escape from poverty. They had not betrayed anyone. They had simply survived, but Brenner would not see it that way. Brenner saw enemies everywhere, and Heinrich knew, with a cold certainty, that Brenner would cause trouble before the harvest was done. Outside, the summer insects sang their endless song. The wheat fields rustled in the night wind. Somewhere in France, Men were dying in trenches and hedgerows. But here, in this strange pocket of the old world planted in the new, there was only the sound of a piano and the smell of fresh bread and the unbearable weight of peace. Heinrich closed his eyes and dreamed of home. He was not sure anymore which home he meant. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a postman who had known the Mueller family for 40 years. Ingrid took the envelope with trembling hands. It bore the seal of the United States War Department. Everyone knew what that seal meant. Heinrich was in the wheat field when he heard the screaming. Ingrid's voice carried across the farm like a wounded animal. He stopped working. The other prisoners stopped too. Even the guard looked up from his newspaper. Thomas came running from the house. His face was white. His fists were clenched. He ran past the barn, past the silos, straight toward the field where the prisoners worked. Heinrich saw him coming and knew immediately what had happened. "Your people killed him." Thomas screamed in English. He grabbed a pitchfork from the ground and swung it wildly. "Your people killed my father." The guard jumped to his feet, reaching for his rifle. Heinrich raised his hands, stepping forward slowly. The other prisoners backed away. Only Brenner smiled, watching the chaos with cold satisfaction. "I am sorry," Heinrich said. His English was broken, but he forced the words out. "I am sorry for your father." Thomas stopped. The pitchfork shook in his hands. Tears streamed down his face. "You don't get to be sorry. You killed him. You and your Nazi friends. You killed him." Heinrich did not move. He thought about his own brother, Kurt, who had died in the firebombing of Hamburg. He thought about the night the sky turned orange and 40,000 people burned alive in a single hour. He thought about the letter his mother had sent, 3 pages of grief that he still carried in his pocket. "My brother is dead too," Heinrich said quietly. "American bombs. Hamburg. 1 year ago." Thomas stared at him. The pitchfork lowered an inch. Then another. The guard kept his rifle raised, waiting. "I did not want this war," Heinrich continued. "I did not choose it, but it chose me. It chose all of us." The pitchfork fell to the ground. Thomas stood there, breathing hard, his shoulders shaking. He was just a boy who had lost his father to a war he barely understood. Wilhelm appeared at the edge of the field. His face was gray with grief, but his voice was steady. He put his arm around Thomas and led him back toward the house. As they passed Heinrich, Wilhelm paused. "Thank you," the old man said in German, "for not fighting." Heinrich nodded. He watched them walk away, grandfather and grandson, leaning on each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Behind him, Brenner laughed softly. That night, Brenner made his move. Heinrich woke to the smell of smoke and the crackle of flames. The grain silo was burning. Bright orange tongues of fire licked the wooden walls, throwing shadows across the farmyard. Prisoners shouted. Guards ran with buckets. Chaos erupted in the darkness. Heinrich saw Brenner standing apart from the crowd, his face lit by the flames, his expression triumphant. This was his message, his proof that they were still soldiers, still the enemy, still at war. That a scream cut through the noise. Ingrid's voice again, but different this time. Desperate. Wilhelm is inside. Heinrich looked at the silo. The fire had spread to the small storage room attached to its base. Through the smoke, he could see a figure slumped against the doorframe. Wilhelm had gone to save the grain records, the ledgers that documented 100 years of Mueller harvests. Now he was trapped. Heinrich did not think. He ran toward the fire, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat hit him like a wall. The smoke filled his lungs. He grabbed Wilhelm under the arms and dragged him backward, away from the flames, his burned hands screaming with pain. They collapsed on the grass 20 feet from the silo. Wilhelm coughed and gasped. His eyebrows were singed, his clothes blackened, but he was alive. Ingrid fell to her knees beside him, weeping. The guards arrested Brenner before dawn. They found matches in his pocket and kerosene on his boots. As they dragged him toward the truck, he turned and looked at Heinrich with pure hatred. "Traitor," he spat. "You are no German. You are nothing." Heinrich watched him go. His hands throbbed with fresh burns. His chest ached from smoke. But he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt clean. Thomas stood on the porch, watching everything. He did not speak, But when Heinrich's eyes met his, the boy nodded once. Just once. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. The second letter arrived 3 weeks after the first. This time, Ingrid opened it slowly, her hands steady, her face prepared for the worst. Thomas stood beside her, barely breathing. Wilhelm watched from his chair, his lungs still weak from the smoke. Then Ingrid began to cry. But these were different tears. "He's alive," she whispered. "Richard is alive." The first letter had been wrong. A confusion of names, a clerical error in the chaos of war. Sergeant Richard Mueller was not dead. He had been captured by German forces near the Falaise Gap, held in a temporary prison camp, then liberated by advancing British troops. He was recovering in a hospital in England. He would come home. Thomas ran outside and shouted at the sky. Wilhelm bowed his head and prayed for the first time in decades. The whole farm seemed to exhale, releasing a breath it had held for weeks. Heinrich heard the news from Kohler, who heard it from the guard. He was sitting alone behind the barn, wrapping his healing hands in fresh bandages. The burns were closing now, but the scars would remain forever. That evening, Wilhelm found him there. The old man moved slowly, still recovering from the fire. He sat down on an overturned bucket and looked at the sunset. "You saved my life," Wilhelm said in German. "You gave me water when I was thirsty," Heinrich replied. "You treated me like a man, not a prisoner." It was the least I could do. They sat in silence for a while. The wheat fields glowed amber in the fading light. The harvest was nearly complete. In a few days, the trucks would come to take Heinrich and the other prisoners to a new camp somewhere in Kansas or Colorado. "My grandfather left Württemberg in 1856, Wilhelm said. He was 18 years old. He had nothing except a few coins and a letter from a cousin who had already crossed the ocean. He never went back. He never saw his parents again." Heinrich nodded. He knew this story. It was his story, too, in a different form. "I think about him sometimes," Wilhelm continued. "What if he had stayed? What if my family had grown up in Germany instead of Minnesota? My son would be wearing your uniform now. He would be fighting for your side. And you might be wearing his uniform, fighting for ours." The thought hung in the air like smoke. Heinrich had considered it many times since arriving at the farm. The randomness of borders, the accident of birth, the thin line between enemy and brother. "There was a boy in my unit," Heinrich said quietly. Friedrich Bauer. He was from a village near Stuttgart. He talked about his cousins in America. He wondered if he would ever meet them. He died at Normandy on the first day. He was 19 years old. Wilhelm closed his eyes. So much waste, so much death. And for what? Lines on a map, flags that will fade, speeches that will be forgotten. Heinrich had no answer. He had stopped believing in answers long ago. The next morning, Thomas came to the barn. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Heinrich without looking at him directly. "Dried apples," Thomas said in English. "From our orchard." And a letter. Heinrich opened the package carefully. Inside, he found the apples and a single folded page. The handwriting was uneven, as if the writer had struggled with each word. "I hope you find your family," Thomas had written. "I hope the war ends soon. I hope we never have to be enemies again." Heinrich read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it in his pocket, next to his mother's letter about Kurt. The trucks arrived at noon. The prisoners lined up in the farmyard, their few possessions gathered in small bundles. Guards checked names against lists. Engines idled. Heinrich shook Wilhelm's hand. The old man's grip was firm, his eyes wet. "If you ever come back to Minnesota after the war," Wilhelm said, "there will be a place for you at our table." Heinrich did not trust himself to speak. He simply nodded and turned away. Thomas stood on the porch, watching. As Heinrich climbed into the truck, the boy raised his hand in a small wave. Heinrich waved back. The truck pulled out of the farmyard and down the dirt road, past the mailboxes with German names, past the oak trees planted by long-dead immigrants, past the church steeple that could have been lifted from any village in Bavaria. Heinrich looked back one last time. The Mueller farm grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the endless wheat fields. The war was not over. There were still months of fighting ahead, more death, more destruction, more letters with terrible news. But something had changed in Heinrich. He had seen the other side of the battlefield, And he had found people who looked like him, spoke like him, came from the same blood and soil. The enemy had a face now, and it looked exactly like home. The truck disappeared over a hill. The wheat continued to grow, and somewhere across the ocean, the war went on without him.